Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Welcome to World Today, our two sessions special edition. I'm your host, Anna. Today we'll take a closer look at the foreign affairs and economic press briefings, unpacking the key insights and helping you better understand the China you want to know. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China's diplomacy under the leadership of President Xi Jinping brings stability amid global turbulence. He made the remarks when addressing the media during the annual press conference on the sidelines of the National People's Congress, one of the most highly anticipated events of China's two sessions political season. Questions from journalists covered a wide range of topics, from head of state diplomacy and the rock-solid ties between China and Russia to China's call for de-escalation over the Iran situation, the importance of mutual respect in China-U.S. relations, and the evolving partnership between China and Europe. They also touched on China's global governance initiative as a timely solution to today's global challenges, as well as its vision for the upcoming APEC meeting in Shenzhen. So what key signals does this press conference send about China's diplomatic strategy in a changing world? To delve into this, joining us on the line are Zha Daojiong, Professor of International Political Economy at the School of International Studies at Peking University, and Andy Mok, Professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Gentlemen, the foreign minister's press conference is always one of the most watched moments during China's two sessions, and is often seen as a key window for the international community to understand China's foreign policy and external relations. This year comes at a time when the global landscape is shifting rapidly, and the international order is under increasing pressure. So, Professor Zha, after listening to the entire press conference, what stood out to you as the most important message from Foreign Minister Wang Yi?
Well, in a very short time span, I think he covered some 21 different questions. There was some overlap. So it's hard to say which one were the most memorable or most important message. But it did come across to me, Mr. Wang was explicit about not signing up to the idea of so-called group of two. However, impromptu, President Trump referred to that when he was in South Korea. It's important at the juncture because over there in Europe and also in much of the global South, there is a different set of expectations. In some sense, this is not conspiracy theory. Frictions in relationships between Beijing and Washington can be to their advantage. So I thought this was important. And second, related to that is an emphasis on seeing the world as multipolar, although I myself, as an academic person, does not really think the word polar is a fitting idea because each and every country has its own agency. There is not much of that space for a major power to gather a smaller group of quote-unquote followers to be under its wing. That's what a polar implies. But in any case, that was my take of a central message, because this is not just about big powers, it's about China and the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Andy, Professor Zhang mentioned China does not agree with the co-governance of great powers, but supporters of the rule of international law with the United Nations at its core. What's your major takeaway from this press conference?
Well, Anna, I would completely agree that, China very clearly, Foreign Minister Wang Yi rejected this notion of a G2 or the U.S. and China acting as, perhaps co-hegemons. And for me, I think the very important core signal is that not only does Beijing see the world as being multipolar, but it is also recognized that the world has entered a period of turbulence, and China intends to act as a stabilizing force within this period of turbulence. And this makes me think of a very famous line from Mao Zedong. So he said, "Under heaven, great disorder brings great order. The situation is excellent." So I think we look here, what does this mean in today's context? There's all kinds of global problems, country versus country conflict. There are these issues that Wang Yi talked about that, from China's view, we should confront injustice, inequality, all these things are also sources of instability. But the idea that these periods of instability create openings for new structures to emerge. And I think what China is very clearly signaling is that it is helping shape the next phase of this global order.
And building on that, Foreign Minister Wang said China is a major force for peace, stability, and justice in the world. He also highlighted the head of state diplomacy is the anchor of China's diplomacy. And we've seen Chinese leadership diplomacy remain very active both last year and at the start of this year. So how important is this leader-to-leader diplomacy in shaping China's foreign policy today?
Well, I think it's incredibly important, Anna. I think, first of all, any large bureaucracy like government, every national government is, in fact, a very large, complex bureaucracy. We have, what some academics would call policy distortion. We think about children playing the game of telephone. I tell you something, you tell someone else something. Further down the line, the message becomes completely distorted. So when we have leader level diplomacy, I think, first of all, that really ensures that the direction, the vision remains much more clear. And I think that especially with countries with effective governance structures, when a top leader says something, does something, we can see that efficiently reflected throughout the entire government. So I think that's very important. And then the third part is, I think, the example it sets. So we all know, especially in large organizations, people look to the leadership for both good and bad examples. So I think with President Xi leading by example here, again, the most precious resource for any leader is their time and energy. And we see so much being devoted to international relations. And I think that can't help but inspire not only the diplomats in the foreign ministry, but really you think about the Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Science and Technology, et cetera, that all have global engagement as a very important part of their mandate. So I think that for these reasons, this head of state diplomacy, and again, as you mentioned, as Foreign Minister Wang Yi described it, the anchor of China's foreign policy, I think is very, very true and very correct, especially as the world becomes more fragmented, that this is very, very important.
Professor Zhao, what's your take on China's head of state diplomacy?
Well, head of state diplomacy, or for the main leader or top leader by a government to be personally involved in diplomacy, including through visits and attending international conferences and forums. I think that's what's meant by head of state diplomacy. In diplomatic protocol, you may have, one leader meeting another leader, but let's leave all those operative sides aside for a moment. That type of diplomacy is, Andy just mentioned, more consequential. It has to do with the rapid spread of information, the ease in access to images about a foreign country, to views, thanks to the improvement of telecommunications. So you have formal government agencies, you also have individuals, you have corporate leaders. It's much harder for all the different actors who either formally or informally have a role in shaping the foreign policy of a country towards, let's put for now, simplify that to another country. Out of that, you have a much larger space for one functional agency of a government to feel, it is doing it for the rest of the government or for the country. Or for that matter, you also have individuals who, especially the powerful ones, he or she is doing things for the whole country. So then head of state diplomacy is important in that it sets the tune, it sets the direction, it actually brings back some level of discipline against the background of the diversification, de facto diversification of foreign policy actors.
Professor Zhao, we know China-Russia high-level diplomatic exchanges remain active, with the two leaders holding a phone conversation on China's New Year's Eve. When talking about Russia, Wang Yi described China-Russia ties as rock solid against all odds. So how do you interpret Beijing's current view of the relationship with Moscow?
When we are doing this in English and we face an English-speaking audience, they have certain expectations or certain framings about Russia or China's relationship with Russia. So it's hard to convince, for any kind of answer, to convince them that, well, to the Chinese or possibly to Russians as well, they have a set of rationale for conducting the business as they have been doing. But the interesting part of the story about Russia is if you look at Europe, right? Europe actually failed to agree on the 20th package of sanctions against Russia, or even for that matter, there was one reported detail about a senior Ukrainian diplomat posted in the United States, saying she had received comments from American officials complaining about the Ukrainian drone having affected American oil investment inside Russia. So you see, it's very complex. It's never really that clear-cut. So going back to the rock-solid idea, what I took a little bit detour to say, we should not be saying, well, the only country that interacts in a substantial way or very much treating or retaining some level of normalcy in relation to Russia, China is far from the only country that's doing that.
Andy, anything to add?
And I do want to add a bit to China's relationship with Russia, because it's not only rock solid, but it plays very important role, I think, in the relationship with the United States, in that China has what it calls a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era, which is a mouthful, but really incorporates, I think, a lot of very, very important assessments and objectives of how the world really must be in order to be truly multilateral, to really create a shared future for mankind or for humanity. And the last thing I just want to briefly add about this is that the realities really matter, what is happening, but the optics matter as well. And here, I think China and Russia both share a very important common experience in that they both have been delegitimized by the West, especially by the United States, in that their concerns, their security necessities are dismissed or delegitimized. So I think this really creates a deep shared understanding. And if we look at it even from a historical perspective, we look at the Western narratives of World War II. It was the US that really won the war against Japan and against Nazi Germany, when the reality is that China was fighting Japan and suffered far greater losses, and perhaps arguably played a much greater role in the defeat of the war against Japanese aggression and fascism. And similarly, Russia paid an enormous cost in blood and treasure against Nazi Germany. And again, I think we could argue that without the ability of Russia to sustain such a long, painful fight, that the defeat of Nazi Germany would have been under much different conditions.
Andy, during the press conference, many of the questions raised by journalists were in some way linked to the United States. Based on Foreign Minister Wang's remarks, how do you think Beijing currently perceives the role of the United States in global affairs? And what signals did you see regarding the future trajectory of China-US relations?
Yeah, so Anna, we hear a lot, and of course it's completely true, that this bilateral relationship between China and the United States is one of the most significant in the world because of the size of their economies, their militaries, etc. So I think that is completely true. Now, within that, I think what Foreign Minister Wang Yi said is especially worth paying attention to, is that if this relationship is approached with sincerity and in good faith, then many, many more good things can happen. So the scope of cooperation can expand. And I think these words were very, very deliberately chosen because we look at, especially the past few months, that President Trump has engaged in, a radical new form of diplomacy that some might call head on a pike diplomacy, meaning directly attacking the head of state, as we've seen with President Maduro in Venezuela, and then the killing of the Ayatollah and a lot of the top leadership in Iran as well, and especially with Iran happening while what seemingly effective negotiations were happening, is probably the very definition of a lack of good faith and negotiating with sincerity. So I think, these words were clearly chosen. So I think this is a big challenge.
Professor Zha, given what has been described by Andy on U.S. factor in today's international affairs, a reporter also asked whether China's global governance initiative, along with its role in groups like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, means Beijing wants to play a bigger role in global governance and perhaps challenge Western-led systems. How do you see that issue, and what exactly is China trying to do when it comes to global governance?
Global governance, was it Western-led or Western-invested, or was it created also together with what we call global south or countries that were less developed? Historians, I'm talking about scholars who studied the formative years of the history of the setups for global governance, including the World Bank. It was not that Western, although they had most of the most greater portion of the funding came from industrialized countries. I never really believe we have much evidence to say for global governance as a topic, whether it's through BRICS or SEO or other, or China coming with this initiative, another country has another initiative. It's really another either or, right? Meaning either you are supporting global governance or you're against it. Because if it was global governance, it was involved expressions of interest, it involved contributions, also involved investment by all parties.
Mm-hmm. Andy, what's your take on the concerns from some Western countries that China wants to play a bigger role in global governance and perhaps challenge Western-led systems? What exactly China is trying to do when it comes to global governance?
Well, Anna, I think, in a sense, they are absolutely correct. I think China does, and I would say, in fact, want to, and I would say must play a greater role in global governance. Again, the size of its economy, the size of its population, et cetera. And it only has not played a greater role in the past due to certain historical conditions. So I think that is absolutely true. What is not true is that China is not trying to overthrow the existing system, but it really is, some analysts would call it a revisionist power, not a revolutionary power. So I think, yes, that is true. I would also say that what China has done is it really has done its homework in terms of doing the hard thinking, the Global Development Initiative and the Global Governance Initiative. We shouldn't forget there is also Global Civilizational Initiative as well. And these actually are interrelated, and I think, again, demonstrate that China has done the hard intellectual labor of thinking about how do we actually bring a better world about. So GDI, the Global Development Initiative, I think we can think of as primarily about economics. How do we materially improve the lives of everyone around the world? GGI, the Global Governance Initiative, is about politics. How do we then manage polities better? How do we manage the relations between states? And then finally, the Global Civilization Initiative, I think, is really meant at a philosophical layer to how do we unleash perhaps the latent power of the different civilizations around the world, their values, their culture, etc. And I think that why this is important is that the world is far from perfect. And anyone that is able to offer a better solution that is practical and implementable, I think certainly should be welcomed by everyone around the world, including the incumbent Western powers. And, I would add just very briefly to Professor Zha's comment about the existing world order. While it was created largely by Western nations, I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that the United States, because it was the last standing great power after World War II, largely dictated the form and even the operation of many of these pillars of the current global order. And again, I think this is changing as the US's share of economic output, I think its relative position on the global stage as we see countries like China, like India. I think Fareed Zakaria once called this the rise of the rest. It's no longer one enormous unipolar country dominating the global order. And this is, again, just the natural order of things.
Mm-hmm. Andy, let's shift gear to the Middle East. When it comes to the region, especially Iran and Gaza, Wang Yi boiled China's stance down to one word, ceasefire. He also warned that hard fists do not make hard facts. The war in Iran that should never have happened and one that benefits no party. Earlier, he also mentioned that China will send a special envoy to the region to conduct mediation efforts regarding the latest escalation in Iran. So how do you interpret China's position here and the role it can play in the Middle East?
Well, this is a very difficult situation. And I think that, China probably is the only major power, perhaps, that can truly and also be seen as an honest broker in that it has relationships with every country in this part of the world, Iran, of course, but also Israel, the Kingdom of KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it is not perceived as supporting only one side. So I think this is very important. I think the stakes could not be higher. I was actually just in the UAE in Abu Dhabi last week, and luckily, left literally a day before the attacks were launched on Iran. And there is so much at stake. The GCC countries are among the wealthiest in the world. They've invested trillions of dollars at stake as they look to transition their countries from being fossil fuel based to perhaps we could say the industries of the future, and they become global aviation hubs, AI, data centers, et cetera, are really all predicated on regional peace and stability. So I think it is a very, very difficult time for these countries that are not directly involved in this conflict, but still are dealing with the very, very challenging collateral effects of this. So I think, China is very clear there must be a two-state solution. This should be resolved through dialogue. And, I think the hope is that if some sort of resolution can be reached, this part of the world will be amazing in terms of what it can do in the region, but I think also its impact globally. So briefly, I think China is the only country with the credibility to truly say it is neutral and objective, and that the stakes couldn't be higher for reaching a conclusion to these long-standing difficulties.
Insightful analysis. Then moving to the Taiwan question, a large portion of the press conference was dedicated to the One China principle, with very strong language regarding the Taiwan region and a historical reference to Japan's militarism. So, Professor Zha, why do you think this year's message carried such a sharp historical context?
Well, much of this is cultural. Cultural, I'm not saying purposely so. It's the connotations, the meanings that are contained in specific expressions. You ask why that one reference, so-called Taiwan contingency, would mean a risk that arise to the level of survival in Japan. Well, number one, right 8 months before, Prime Minister made that comment. Among many things, the mainland actually made it easier for Taiwanese residents to take up business or gain employment on the mainland. And there was no sharp, let's say, exchange of rhetoric between the two sides. It's out of blue to the Japanese expression. Number two, more profoundly, the naming of what's sometimes translated into English as a contingency. I don't think contingency carries that load of meaning or the historical depth into that very Japanese phrase. That same set of Chinese characters that describe a Japanese sentiment that's translated as contingency or the so-called survival risk, precisely the ones that Imperial Japan, authorities of Imperial Japan used to justify both the invasion and later on extension of Japanese occupation of northeastern China, out of northeastern China to 1931 to take on the rest of the China. So we, out of those two, and there's more. Here in China, anyone who is educated about the history of China and Japan, or the involving the status of Taiwan, which Mr. Wang Yi referenced the Cairo declarations or Potsdam declarations, and also especially the wording, the framing by the Japanese Prime Minister is so reminiscent of a painful past. But what I have just said is a lot of times lost for many of my colleagues, including those who have had impressive credentials of education from what's called world-class universities on political science or related history. They would look at this by first beginning and we say, oh, Japan is an ally of the West. And number two, they may extend this to another reference to global governance or East versus West. I can go on and on, but I do think this is serious where you need great need for serious expression of earnest sentiment. We shouldn't just let it be simplified to whether China, Japan, or alliance or not.
Okay, thank you for the analysis. Andy, how do you rate Wang Yi's remarks on this issue? What kind of signals do you think China is trying to send?
Well, I think it couldn't be more clear. And I think Professor Zha did a wonderful job of explaining that. The only thing I might add to this is that clearly there are external forces that see gain from fomenting this kind of separatist activity. And I think we also can't separate this from the history of Japan. And we know that there are currents within the Japanese political system that really see kind of an overturning of the verdict of history, right? If we can call this where we are post 1945, and that this is very dangerous. And I think some in Japan would see that Taiwan is a vehicle or an instrument for doing this. So again, I think this is why Foreign Minister Wang Yi really appropriately had such clear and strong language about this, not only citing the legal infrastructure around this, the historical precedent, and I think also China's stance on this question.
Thanks for those insightful analyses. That were Andy Mok, professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Professor Zha Daojiong from International Political Economy at the School of International Studies at Peking University. Let's have a short break. Coming back, we'll explore China's financial priorities for the coming year. This is World Today. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're listening to World Today, 2 Sessions edition. China will set up national-level mergers and acquisition funds to help venture capital investors find an exit. How urgent is the need? And with cumulative dividends and share buybacks hitting a record high, what does that signal about the reshaping of China's securities market? My colleague Tu Yun talked with Yao Shujie, Changhong Professor of Economics at Chongqing University, Zhang Gong, Professor of Economics, University of International Business and Economics, and Einar Tangen, a Senior Fellow of the Canadian think tank, the Center for International Governance Innovation.
So first, let's take a look at the bigger picture. China's fiscal and financial authorities have outlined their priorities for supporting economic and social development this year. So from a macro perspective, what stands out to you most about this policy? And Is the bigger goal stabilizing growth and market expectations or pushing structural transformation? This question goes to you all. Let's begin with Einar, please.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's a layered approach. This is just one part of it. They're looking at the structure of mergers and acquisitions. One of the problems that you have is turnover. Markets, because of uncertainty, groups that invested initially, they want to go to market, but there are impediments. And what the government has said, okay, we're going to try a multi-layered approach. First off, we're going to put this $1 trillion fund out there that should leverage about $10 trillion. And they're hoping that this will allow entities to sell so that you can recycle the initial money that was put in by VCs, et cetera, and that can go back into the system. But they're also supporting it with loans. There's another $1 trillion for that. And then technical innovation, there's another $1 trillion for that. So it's a very layered approach, looking not only at these entities that have innovation, but making sure that small and medium-sized business entities have options. China has found it very difficult to adjust to lending money based on a business plan. They always want to do it on assets. But, in technology, you really have to be able to evaluate there are. And I think there are some AI solutions to that we can discuss later.
So what impressed you most is the overall overhaul or increase of the funding?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a layered approach. It's not just, okay, we're going to throw a dart at something and see if it does anything. They've taken a very, very systematic approach. I think 2022, 23 were like record years for foreign direct investment into China. And then since then, it's declined slightly. Last year was still very good in terms of the rankings. But, it's an enormous task when you're trying to do innovation. This is all new stuff. When somebody says, oh, okay, I have a new AI product, what do you benchmark it against? You don't know. So you have to have people who are very knowledgeable, and then you have to have the finance facilities in order to get them to capital so that they can develop. So China sees this as maturing their internal markets. And they're concerned about, companies leaving, especially with the divide in the world with the U.S. trying to put pressure and isolate China. They want to keep as much technology and manufacturing here, but they can't force companies to do that. So they're offering incentives, which is basically, making their system more mature.
John, your take here?
Well, I want to talk about that, a trillion yuan national level merger and acquisition fund. I think this is, as it says very clearly, intended to create another venue for exit for venture capitals. And there are a couple of reasons why China is doing something like this. We all understand very well that innovation and investment in new cutting edge technologies is very much driven by venture capital. This is an indispensable ingredient of the whole model. You can't have a success story without capital supporting to this. But the way the VC capital works is that they're all looking for an exit. Sometimes they have a time window. You can't prolong this for too long. It's the way VC funds are run. You need this investment to be recouped quickly, well, at least over a period of few years. But the problem is that I think it's getting more and more difficult to put these new companies onto the public equity market. IPO, I mean, there's a long line right now of these high-tech companies lining up to go IPO at the equity markets here in China. And this causes pressure on the equity market because, this is actually, it creates more supply of the stocks essentially, right? And there's some pricing pressure on the stock market if you have too many IPOs a year. In the past, a lot of these IPOs go to the United States, go to Europe. Now, with the the geopolitical tension, with the America's China policy, and with the intense competition between the two countries, it's getting more and more difficult. It's also more companies are getting listed on Hong Kong Stock Exchange these days. So I think this creates another venue essentially, for the VC capitalists' money to be recouped via these M&A activities. In other words, you basically created a buffer between initial capital investment and the eventual exit through IPO, right? So essentially, you create a somewhere in between on one side to make sure that the VC capitals are being recouped. On the other hand, make sure that there's not creating too much of a pressure on the equity market.
Right.
I think it's a brilliant idea, actually.
We'll have a dive deeper into this aspect later on. But Shujie, your take here, from a macro perspective, what stands out to you most about this policy mix?
We have to look at the basic foundation of what China really needs at this stage, because this is the first year of the 15th five-year plan. China is facing two challenges. The first challenge is the domestic structural transformation, and the second challenge is the external uncertainty and risk. So the fiscal and financial policy, as you just outlined, there's lots of very concrete policy measures, including the 1 trillion for the M&A security emergence, and also for the fiscal deficit, state fund to stimulate the domestic economy expansion. I think you have to look at the concept why the central government want to pour so much money into such an area. The first area, the 1 trillion yuan for the acquisition and merger fund, is basically to support the technological company who lack financial support, but they have huge potential to drive the future economy development and technological independency at the global level. So this is not a one shock. I think that's going to be a very long-term, year after year, policy if you turn out to be effective. And the second is why the government pouring so much money, and also in the next stage is going to neglect the financial and the monetary system to give more liquidity. So that investors, consumers, and also market entities, enterprises, and local government, they will become more relaxed to invest more into the real economy. And all this kinds of effort is basically to achieve the set goal of 4.5 to 5% GDP expansion in 2026. Because this is the first year of the five-year plan. It's very important that the policy ammunitions, the fiscal and monetary policy have to be highly precise, effective, and also surmountable to all different barriers in the economy system.
Yes, we want a good opening, like they say. A good opening is halfway to success, right? So both Shujie and John mentioned this national level M&A fund. It's a new thing. Yes, I know John mentioned how important it is, but why wait until now? And what prompted this move? Some observers associate it to, the recent relocation of the AI startup Manus from China to Singapore. Does that case highlight weaknesses in China's venture ecosystem? Ina.
Okay, well, there's two questions in there. Okay, what is China doing? And I would put it simply, and I think John and Shuchi would agree with me. This is about, you want new productive forces. That's technology. You have to have a means of financing them. You can't say just, make it out of thin air. You have to provide support. So these are just simply support items that they're doing now, especially because they're emphasizing that, the way forward for China is, as they keep saying, new productive forces. In terms of Manus, that is slightly different. There are a lot of entities that are trying to make sure that they have as much market as possible. With the difficulties, geopolitical pressure that the United States is putting on China as it seeks to isolate it, if you're based in China, the likelihood is that you're going to have real problems. Just remember, TikTok was based in Singapore. They had a CEO from Singapore, but that didn't seem to matter at all to the United States. So in the kind of hysteria that's going on, a lot of companies are saying, okay, we have to have a strategy so that we're not cut off from markets. So that was really the central core of what they're doing. It's also, you should notice that it's easier for cross-border transactions, liquidity, if you're in a third country like Singapore. China, as I said earlier, is trying to put together a package where the new technologies developed here, manufactured here, applied here. But they're not going to stop companies from trying to develop markets outside. That would be, cutting off your nose to spite your face. So it's all, I think, very well thought out. But there's only so much you can do when you have a very hostile global partner. It should be a partner.
But if we have this, national level mergers and acquisitions fund, which is expected to help venture capital investors exit more easily, would that be more helpful or make China more attractive?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're providing a facility to get out of these investments. That's what John was talking about, one of the funds. And they'll say, we want to be in for 3 to 5 years and then we need an exit. And this is what they tell the people that, invest money. So they need to keep on that schedule, and they don't want to sell at a loss, obviously. They, want to make gains. So having these additional facilities is very important, but it goes beyond that. They're also setting up funds that will lower the cost of borrowing, which, of course, is very advantageous to small entities because they don't have, they're borrowing money and they want to borrow it as cheap as possible. And these companies are starting out as small, medium-sized business entities. So they have tax breaks, they have all sorts of policies in terms of if you locate in certain economic development zones, you can get lower tax rates for 5 years. You can bring in outside specialists, highly talented people. And this is all part of economic development. You don't just do one part of it. It has to be cohesive and whole. And this is where China really excels because they do a lot of planning. They learn from what happened before. They study what is successful in other areas. And then as a result, they're able to put something together. Now, it doesn't always work out exactly as planned, but what do? They adjust. And they keep adjusting until they get it right. And that has been literally the reason that China has been able to go as far as it has in such a short period of time.
Then, John, how urgent is the problem the fund is trying to solve?
Well, some of my VC friends have been telling me that they're very concerned about the prospect of exit strategy being very much limited by the much diminished chance of going IPO in the United States equity markets. And we all know that the waiting line at the Shanghai Stock Exchange, at Shenzhen Stock Exchange is very long. So that's a big concern. At the same time, the regulators don't want to see a flood of IPOs onto the market. That's going to have some impact on the pricing at the equity markets these days. We have a fairly good run so far for both Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchanges. So I think the idea is very clear, just to buy some time. And, the state essentially is creating another venue, probably not a permanent venue, but at least buying some time so that, these VC funds can recoup their money and move on to the next great projects. I think it's a very clever idea, actually.
Right.
I don't see this has ever been done before in history. I mean, the state comes out organizing a huge fund for M&A activities, essentially creating a pool of these great assets, waiting to be eventually materialized. There's a
You're
lot
saying
of
it's
wealth at stake, I
unprecedented
guess.
globally or nationally?
I think the fund is a domestic fund.
Yeah.
I think the focus will be, investing in companies domestically. And I'm not even sure that companies overseas would be interested in something like this. I think from a VC's perspective, the first priority is to get publicly listed. I think that's the most straight way of exiting from their investment.
Right. Then who do you think stands to benefit most from this fund then, apart from those tech startups?
Yeah, the purpose is not for the state to benefit, but eventually I think the state will. In the short term, I think the state is just to facilitate the innovation company, the high-tech company, to develop quickly so that they can have new breakthrough which would meet the country's desire as an innovation country, which increase the level of quality of the national economy and also technological independence from different countries as the external risk is very high. But I think the fund, if it is used very effectively so that some new technology will come to the market and being implemented at the real economy to propel the real sector, the industrial sector, the service sector, so that they can generate commercial profit. And once they generate commercial profit, then the state will benefit. But this kinds of venture capital, this kinds of A&M fund, they have to have a long-term vision, because in the short term, it means that you put the money into the market, but you may not have an immediate return. But once the return is coming, it may take time, but it can be very massive, and then the state will benefit. Actually, the state is look at the global or the social benefit of the entire country rather than the state financial ministry or the central bank. The state would have a very longer term to see how this investment will benefit, and they supported a particular sector or a few sector, especially in the AI and also automation, robotic, and also new energy sector. So they have to be highly targeted. They're going to have a long-term benefit for the whole society, not only the enterprises as such, but also the consumers and also the social environment.
Right. Thanks, Zhi. And now let's move on to fiscal policy, something new there. Well, this year's fiscal deficit will rise from about 5.6 trillion yuan to roughly 5.9 trillion, or over 850 billion US dollars, hitting a new high. But it will still account for roughly 4% of the country's GDP. And new government bond issuance will approach 12 trillion yuan, or 1.7 trillion US dollars, also a new high. So I know, what does that level of fiscal expansion tell us about where China is in the economic cycle right now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, we've been talking about this, the geopolitical competition, mainly from the United States. This is a situation where China has to figure out how it's going to grow itself internally, and that's going to need capital. We've talked about a number of different facilities, including this M&A fund. But if you're trying to develop internal growth and internal consumption, it's going to take an investment. And given the headwinds, they have to do that themselves. The number is not wildly high if you compare it to what the United States or Japan is doing. But China's been very fiscally conservative in terms of its national budget. It has a fairly low by the size of the country standard in terms of debt. But there are real problems that are developed within the provinces and cities. They had these special purpose vehicles, which were kind of off-book transactions that they were using. Hopefully, in their mind, they thought, well, maybe there's some way we can stir up some dust here and create some opportunities and some jobs, and this will, be a benefit to my next job posting. But a lot of them didn't work out. So there's a lot of zombie companies and debt that's kind of sitting out there, and the new management moves in and they suddenly discover that their hands are tied because they have so much debt. So the government is pushing some money towards the provinces and cities and saying it's time to clean up the books. They're also shoring up the banks, putting more money into them. This will increase their ability to lend money. And in part of that is just not just the quantity of money. They have a special facility of $1 trillion, a trillion renminbi, which they are going to leverage to create lower loans. So they will loan money to banks at a very low level that can then be passed through to small, medium-sized business entities, startup, etc. That's what I was talking about, this layered approach to providing everything that's necessary to have a robust economy that is based on these new productive forces and also encouraging spending. The better that these companies are at selling things and providing jobs, the more disposable income there will be, and therefore the more confidence that Chinese consumers will have. But there's also other parts of that in terms of the social safety net. But this confidence issue is absolutely critical. And they're doing everything they possibly can to show that they're involved in the process. There was long descriptions about the processes. I think it kind of went over most people's heads. But if you start examining it, It's very, very comprehensive, and it covers all areas of society. This, what
Right.
we're talking about, is just one on the financing side, but all of these pieces fit together. And that is what's unique about China, is they harmonize, and they spend a lot of hundreds of thousands of man hours harmonizing all of their policies so they're going in one direction. Because once you have a compass, you have to make sure that all the cats are going in the same direction. And that can be quite challenging when you have 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, let's narrow it down to this fiscal policy. One new feature, I should say, of this central government transfers to local governments is that policymakers are stressing better efficiency and greater flexibility in how local governments use those funds. So, Shujie, why is that emphasis so important now?
Yeah, China is a large country, as Annie just mentioned. We have 1.4 billion people, and also across a vast area with different economic and social environmental conditions, and also natural and human capital endowments. They are so diversified. And different region, for example, like the eastern region is more economy and technological advanced, and in the central and the western region is relatively lagging behind. And in northeastern China, it requires a lot of investment to legitimize the traditional economy. So the central government play a role of helping, the lagging behind region to catch up with the more advanced region, so the country can have a more balanced economy and social development. By generating a more balanced development, the country could be more integrated and to generate a bigger universal market in China, which is required by the current policy. So that natural resources, production factors in the less developed regions in the central and western and northeastern part of the country, they can fully exploit it to the level close to the eastern region, so that China can move steadily from a middle-income country to a high-income country, and then to a modernized socialist economy system. So the balancing of the whole country is a very important and fundamental issues. And to fulfill this task, the central government have to use the central fund, whether it is from tax revenue or other revenue resources or even the budget deficit. Whatever mean, it's going to target it where the country need and where the region need requirement for further investment. And this has been a process for many, many years. It is well calculated into the 5-year plan. And this 10 trillion yuan of central to regional transfer is a very important financial resource to achieve this kinds of national long-term vision development.
But with greater flexibility, would there also be any risks like weaker oversight or mismatches between funding and projects? Do you have any concern, Shujie?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the amount of money is fairly massive in a way, and some project could be fail, could not achieve the desired objective. But on the main, I think, according to the past experience, I think the central government is highly intelligent in terms of targeting where the project need and balancing the risk of the regional local authority and the central authority. So on the main, I think the real outcome is much better than we expected, and there are certainly some failure projects, but most of the project, especially the vast majority of the project, turned out to be highly efficient and profitable, and it is good for the country's balanced development, as I just mentioned.
That was Yao Shujie, Changkong Professor of Economics, Chongqing University, Zhang Gong, Professor of Economics at University of International Business and Economics, and Einar Tangen, a Senior Fellow of the Canadian think tank, the Center for International Governance Innovation, speaking with Tu Yun. That's all the time for this 2 sessions edition of World Today. I'm Ge Anna. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.